Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at the Tudor Black Bay Chrono. As with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and take a look at the history of this watch. We're going to look more specifically at the chronograph watches from Tudor as opposed to Black Bay or the Black Bay series. So we're going to go back into the 1970s now, specifically to 1970, which is when Tudor released their first ever chronograph watch. Tudor was mainly known really as a dive company or dive watch company. Obviously they are the sister brand of Rolex, who primarily at that time specialized in Submariners, GMT Masters, which were built off a dive watch case. So the chronograph series of watches wasn't particularly focused for Tudor until the 1970s, or till 1970, which is when they released their first chronograph model, which was the Oyster Date chronograph. Naturally, you would have thought that Tudor would just copy Rolex. Obviously, being under the same umbrella company-wise, you would have thought they would just replicate what the Daytona was and maybe alter a few bits, but in fact, they went for a totally different look. And the Oyster Date Chrono was actually very different. Instead, the Daytona had a 36mm case size and the Tudor went for a 39mm case size. So it was well ahead of its time in terms of case diameters. It was looking at a much larger case diameter versus what most of the watches at the time were sporting. So that was really cool, very different in that respect. It looked much more sporty as well compared to the Daytona. It did have a little whiff of dive watch in there as well. It was more colourful. It was just a little bit more visually interesting, definitely a younger feel, but definitely a more sporty feel to the watch compared to the Daytona. The Oyster Date chronograph also featured a date window, obviously given away in the name Oyster Date, but that was something that the Daytona didn't have. So that was definitely an interesting kind of one-up that the Oyster Date had over the Daytona. The first few references that were released had a mixture of steel bezels and also plexiglass bezels, again also giving it quite a different look to the Daytona at the time. In 1976, a few years later, Tudor made a big bold move and installed an automatic movement inside the Oyster Date chronograph. The Daytona itself actually didn't get a automatic movement for another 12 years after this. So again, the Tudor was quite ahead of its time in that respect. But in order to fit this automatic movement inside the watch, they had to increase the depth of the watch case quite considerably in order to accommodate the rotor and the extra winding mechanisms part of that movement. And doing so, like I said, increased the depth. It then got its nickname, the Big Block, due to the larger size amongst collectors. The dial also changed as well. Instead of having two subdials, we now have three subdials. So again, giving it a very different feel and look. So it really changed in 1976, only a few years after it was released. In 1995, 20 years later, Tudor revamped the collection again, and they redesigned all the cases, making them much more slender, much more elegant, slightly more Daytona-esque in some respects. They also introduced a sapphire crystal for the watch and also an aluminium bezel insert, so kind of upgraded the watch massively in terms of materials and longevity, which was definitely welcome. Lots of other watches at that time, in fact previous to that time, were starting to get crystals, sapphire crystals, as opposed to plexiglass. And then skip another few years on to 2010, which marked the 40th anniversary for the Oyster Date chronograph, or chronograph watches for Tudor. And to celebrate, they released the Heritage chronograph, and the watch was really different again to what we'd seen the years prior. The case size had actually jumped up now to 42mm from 39mm, so very big jump up in size, which is in line with the trends or modern trends of larger watch cases around that time, or the mid to late 2000s were definitely a more focused audience on bigger case sizes and bigger watches. So they definitely listened, and they also tried to hark back to the original designs from 1970, and they copied two of those original dials, which is really cool. They look fantastic in that modern case size or shape and design. They also removed the Cyclops on the dial, for the date window, so no Cyclops bubble, which in my opinion looked so much better. And they also dropped it back to 2 subdials as opposed to the 3 subdials, which again, in my opinion, looks much better. In 2017, they released a new movement in a collaboration with Breitling, and this new movement had a 70-hour power reserve, which is pretty amazing, and that still remains in the watch today. And in 2019, we got another revamp, which was a slight reduction in case size from 42mm down to 41, and also they slimmed out the case depth as well in order to make it feel a little bit more elegant, a little bit more slim. And the way they did that was remodeling the whole movement inside, and also the way it was sat in the case and the actual distance between the hands and the glass, or the top of the glass. That concludes the history on the chronograph watches from Tudor, and therefore the Black Bay chronograph. Let's move on to the features of this watch, and we're going to start as always with the clasp. The clasp on this watch is a pretty standard, nice clasp. It's very solid, it's very secure, it's got a fold over section similar to the Oyster clasp that we see from Rolex. The clasp on this watch also has this kind of little wing or turned up part, which helps you to lift off the bracelet and take it off, lift off the clasp, sorry, and take it off safely, which is really appreciated. The one thing that I don't love about this clasp though is that it doesn't have any adjustability without the use of tools. So you have to use a tool to press in or within the clasp to change the position of the bracelet or where it sits inside the clasp. Whereas on Oyster bracelets or Oyster clasps from Rolex with the Easy Link adjustment, you can expand out the bracelet by 5mm without the use of tools really, really easily, which is definitely useful for us in the UK and many other parts of the world where the change in temperature can mean your wrist changes size. And obviously in the UK we have drastic changes of temperature even within a week. So it's definitely a feature that a lot of our clients use all the time. So that's one thing that I wish they did add, was some sort of adjustability that's easier to do them with tools. Moving on to the bracelet now, we have an almost all brush finish bracelet apart from the sides, and we've got these kind of riveted style links as well, which is quite an interesting look. Really nice, comfortable bracelet, very hard wearing, very similar to an Oyster bracelet. The thing that I don't love about this bracelet though is those rivets. I personally much prefer the slender, more elegant look that a standard Oyster bracelet has as opposed to this bracelet. But nonetheless, I know it in keeps with the kind of vintage retro feel that this watch has, or heritage feel, which is really nice. Moving on to our case now, we've got a lovely, beautiful case on this watch with kind of beveled edges, a mixture of polish and brush finish. It's just really cleverly finished. It definitely has a much higher end feel than its price point, which is really cool to see. In general, the case does have quite sharp edges, which is nice. Again, definitely reminiscent of something like a Submariner or a GMT, as opposed to something more elegant like a Daytona. So definitely interesting to see that mixture of brushed and those sharp edges. The case is kind of well proportioned. It is pretty well proportioned actually. The depth is one thing that I don't love. A lot of Tudor watches and Tag Heuer watches all tend to edge towards a very deep case depth, which I don't love. It doesn't sit as nicely on the wrist as something that's more slender and slim and elegant, like a lot of the Rolex watches, Patek Philippe watches, Audemars Piguet. So it is a shame that they make them so deep, but nonetheless it is a nicely proportioned watch. It does sit really beautifully on the wrist. My wrist is 16.5 centimeters in circumference, and you can see, despite the fact that my wrist edges on the small side, it definitely doesn't look overpowering on my wrist at all. 41mm case size is slightly larger than I personally would normally wear. I prefer 40mm downwards, ideally 39mm, but this definitely doesn't seem over-facing. I'd say it wears pretty true to its 41mm case size, and I think if they made it slimmer, I think it would look more beautiful, would wear probably a little bit smaller and would just sit nicer on the wrist, in my opinion. But definitely for someone that has a larger wrist, this will look fantastic. You might actually want that additional depth that this offers. I do like the pushers on the watch as well for the chronograph. I don't love the fact they're screw down, but it is obviously true to the original Oyster date chronograph, and also more importantly, in a way, the Daytona that it kind of was replicating. So yeah, I do think that is very Tudor and Rolex-esque, but I wish they didn't have screw downs because it's much easier to use. The crown is really beautiful. I love this crown. I love that kind of oversized style, it definitely is a unique looking feature of the watch. Moving on to our bezel and our dial, we've got a black bezel and black dial, really elegant, wonderful, looks really beautiful how it's paired together. In a way, it's actually very similar with this setup, the chronograph setup, the white aspects on the dial, the black dial or black base to the dial, and also the black bezel too, definitely gives it a little bit of a Speedmaster moonwatch kind of vibe about it, especially as it's got this heritage kind of retro vintage feel too. Definitely gives it slightly Omega moonwatch vibes, which is really cool. I like that for sure. I love how symmetrical this dial is too. We've got 2 sub dials as opposed to the 3 that we normally see on most chronographs. We've got small seconds on the left hand side, so around 9 o'clock, and then on the right hand side around 3 o'clock we have our chronograph minutes. So we've got chronograph seconds as well, obviously on our second hand in the center of the dial, and then minutes and hours for the actual elapsed time. Down at 6 o'clock we have our date, but just everything is really, really well balanced. I love the little aspects of red as well on the dial, with the depth gauge or depth rating and the tip of the chronograph second hand. Really lovely, just tying that in, a little hint of sportiness in there with the red, but that vintage feel with the black, and just very classic looking, very beautiful. I love the silvery subdials too. The kind of pandery effect just makes it look fantastic. I also do love the crystal on this watch as well, how it's curved. It gives it again a bit of a moonwatch type of feel, kind of vintage Hesalite curved crystal, which is just fantastic. Yeah, love that. It's one of my favorite features again with the crown, is the curved sapphire crystal. And obviously being sapphire too means it won't scratch very easily. So that concludes the features. On to whether or not I would own this watch. I would definitely own this watch. If they made it thinner, I'd go out and buy it now. It's the only thing that's holding me back from actually buying it myself and owning it would be the fact that it is a little bit deep for my liking. I'm used to thinner watches now. But yeah, really lovely watch. Don't be put off by the slightly deeper depth or size. It definitely doesn't wear too big actually on the wrist, as you can see from the video right now. But yeah, overall beautiful watch. Love the vintage feel, love the symmetry on the dial, love the small nuances and details like the crown, the curved crystal, and also the polished and beveled edges and just different finishes on this piece makes it feel far more high-end than its price point. And that is always such a brilliant feature on a watch, is when a watch feels much more expensive than it is. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments what you think of this Tudor Black Bay chronograph. Let us know what other watches you like from Tudor, and let us know what other videos you'd like us to do, whether it's reviews or discussion videos. We're open to suggestions from you guys in the comment section. And as always, if you're interested in this watch or any other watch in the Tudor collection, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description, and also at the end of the video, it'll be a pleasure to call this watch into stock for you.